Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for coming. My name's Craig Nicholl. I am the Communications and Engagement Lead for the University of Glasgow School of Social and Environmental Sustainability based here in Dumfries. For 25 years, the university's had a presence here in Dumfries, and we actually have our campus right here on the Crichton grounds. And thank you for joining us tonight as we kick off the first in a series of events where we're going to bring together academia with industry partners and explore research topics and live topics that are impacting our society, both here in Scotland and around the world. Our campus and our school here in Dumfries covers a number of different subject areas, from education and environment through to sustainable development, and tonight's topic of conversation, which is tourism. So I'm going to pass over now to my colleague Amy, who is going to introduce our panel. This event is interactive. We do want questions from the audience, so please think up what you want to ask our panelists as we get to the Q&A session later on in the hour. But you're welcome to ask anything you like of our panel, and we will have some moderated questions for them as well. So I'll pass over to Amy, but just welcome once again on behalf of the university, and thanks for coming.
Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for joining our event this evening. I'm delighted to welcome our panel, starting off with Dr Anna de Jong. Anna de Jong is a senior lecturer in tourism at the University of Glasgow and director of research within the School of Social and Environmental Sustainability. Anna is an interdisciplinary social scientist who researches spatial justice in tourism development processes, guided by wider concerns of resident inequalities and accessibilities. She is principal investigator on the Just Tour project, which aims to identify the value that tourism development brings us to places, as well as determine place-based solutions to the challenges encountered by residents living in tourism destinations. Welcome, Anna. Thank you so much. Next, I'd like to welcome Lesley Judge. Lesley Judge has been a driving force in the tourism sector for over 2 decades, empowering organisations to develop digital and data-driven strategies. She managed private and public sector projects via her own consultancy before joining Interface in 2018 to build strategic partnerships between industry and academia and help organisations to innovate. In 2020, she co-founded the Travel Tech for Scotland cluster, part of the Edinburgh Futures Institute, and set up and continues to chair the digital working group of Scotland's Visitor Management Strategy Steering Group, chaired by Visit Scotland. She is a graduate of the Destination Leaders Programme and a Director of Women in Tourism. And finally, I would like to introduce Professor Sandro Carnicelli. Sandro is a Professor of Tourism and Leisure Studies and the Deputy Director of the Centre Deputy Director of the Centre for Culture, Sport and Events at the University of the West of Scotland. He is a member of the International Academy for the Development of Tourism Research in Brazil and former co-chair of the Royal Society of Edinburgh Young Academy of Scotland. Sandro is the Editor-in-Chief of the World Leisure Journal and Associate Editor for Event Management Journal. He is on the advisory board of the Annals of Leisure Research and on the board of Leisure Studies. So thank you so much for joining us this evening and welcome to our panel. So tonight we are going to be discussing the key question of, is it possible to balance growth with sustainable tourism? So to start us off this evening, I'd like to welcome Dr Anna de Jong to share her insights on this question. Okay, Anna.
Thanks, Amy, and thanks everyone for coming. It's really nice to see you here for the first in this Sustainability Insights panel. So the question that Amy just posed, is it possible to balance growth with sustainability? To have a think about how we might engage with this question this evening, I thought it could be useful as the first speaker to do some scene setting, to think about what we mean by these terms growth and sustainability within the context of the tourism industry. We have, of course, witnessed exponential growth in tourism in recent years, an emerging middle class with increasing levels of disposable income, coupled with the ability to increasingly move further, faster, much more frequently, has led to a context whereby multiple international and domestic trips each year is seen as a human right in many global north contexts and increasingly in many global south contexts. travel is something that's fundamental to our well-being, or is perceived by many to be. So these social and economic shifts have facilitated the ability of the tourism industry to become a crucial economic development tool within Scotland, of course, and internationally, but particularly within peripheral areas and in areas that have experienced industrial decline. And this is something we've seen in the south of Scotland with the construction of the South of Scotland Destination Alliance, which is basically the idea of it in utilising public money to generate tourism as an economic development tool. So tourism is seen as particularly enticing in such contexts because it requires, well, it is understood to require relatively low levels of direct public investment, whilst compared to other potential industries that could be developed, whilst simultaneously offering higher levels of employment, entrepreneurial opportunities, the ability to bolster community cohesion through private investment in things like events and festivals, accommodation infrastructure, investment in green and blue spaces, and is also claimed to conserve environmental assets, which we've seen with the recent Galloway National Park bid that's been successful. Tourism success in these contexts is generally measured through numbers, particularly visitor numbers, where the idea is to see an increase in visitor numbers over time through accessing new markets. And it's really this growth-focused narrative that prioritises high visitor numbers to a particular region, to a very specific geographical area, that produces a paradox within tourism, whereby success in tourism development can hinder the very thing that it sets out to achieve, where high visitor numbers to very specific geographical areas can lead to environmental degradation and influence issues, or exacerbate issues in terms of our social inequities in communities. As such, questions around how we might limit these impacts whilst bolstering these potential benefits have followed, with sustainability arguably being the most commonly drawn upon framework in which to respond to these concerns. So that's a bit about growth, but to really understand why sustainability has been drawn on so commonly, it's useful to take a step back and think about this origin story of sustainability, where it's generally narrated that the concept sustainability emerged within a forest management context in Germany in the 1700s, where focus was with how we might conserve the finite resources available in the forest to ultimately ensure that that forest would be available into the future, ultimately ensuring overall that the business itself of forestry management would continue into the future. So this managerial context in which this term sustainability arose has heavily influenced its uptake in many professional contexts, including tourism, because within many tourism business contexts, it's similarly seen as very applicable and very important to think about how we might manage the resources within that business context in a way that ensures that they're available to that business into the future. Particularly, this is something that's become even more important or more challenging as our changing climates have led to more vulnerabilities around our resources, as well as many other social, economic and political issues that we're grappling with. So it's this intimate connection that we have between growth and sustainability that's led to a coupling of the two terms, but also it influences the way we can think about sustainability within tourism contexts, what's available within that context, but also some of the challenges that it leads to. And I'm just going to highlight two particular challenges that are relevant within the context of this evening's discussion. The first is, when we're thinking about sustainability within a tourism context, we're often thinking about alternative tourism products, the creation of different forms of tourism such as ecotourism, nature-based tourism, community-based tourism that offer lower intensive forms of tourism development to particularly ethically conscious consumers. So it's the creation of a niche tourism product primarily. And there's an ability within such context to focus less on the visitor numbers because you can charge a higher premium, and so you get that return on that revenue generation without having that same intensity on, say, an environment or a community. So whilst these examples, these alternatives are really valuable and incredibly important in going some way to offer travellers something different, to seeing what could be done, they still do rely on, they don't necessarily completely deconstruct or dismantle the system, the growth narrative that we have. They offer an alternative, but the traveller usually generally has to still engage with the broader tourism ecosystem. Say if you want to be an international traveller and you're visiting an ecotourism resort in Bali, you still have to undertake an international trip, which has the quite high intensity in terms of its emissions. So it doesn't completely dismantle the growth narrative that we have. It also, sorry, I move on. I completely lost my train of thought on that one, or the other point that I wanted to say. But moving to the second challenge is that in terms of the sustainability framework that we're working with, generally we're thinking we have tourism alternative products, but also within an actual business context, we generally think about sustainability in terms of measures. So measures implemented, say, within a specific business or a set of type of businesses, say accommodation providers, or within a tourism governance context. And here it has seemed to be more readily possible to understand how things like the environment and the economy could be drawn on as resources to be managed in terms of the sustainability framework that we have. But society, our communities, thinking about how they could be conceptualised as a resource has proved really challenging, because the grammar of sustainability is almost the wrong way around in this context. Rather than placing the business at the forefront, we need to be thinking about how communities, the extent to which tourism development actually enhances the capacities of community, and what forms of development look like in terms of benefiting our communities, as opposed to placing the business front and centre. And we've really seen the lack of focus on the social in terms of social sustainability within tourism contexts time and again, and increasingly in recent years. You know, it's almost been impossible this summer to not be met with a new news article each day, if not multiple news articles, that have highlighted these concerns of high visitor numbers through the discourse of over-tourism to very specific geographical areas, and the effects this is having on the livelihoods of the residents, of the communities that live in these places that are focused on high levels of tourism. So really just as the first speaker this evening, I just wanted to set up how tourism is understood within these contexts, and this intimate relationship we have between growth and sustainability, and the challenges that come from that. And at the same time, though, there are really important alternatives that we can work with, celebrations of best practice, different ways of doing things that might not completely dismantle this growth narrative that we have, but they do go some way to challenging it. So here I'm going to end to open up space to Lesley and Sandro, who are going to think a bit more about what these alternatives look like, what they are currently, as well as what they could be in terms of practical examples, but also more radical ways of rethinking the growth model through things like degrowth. And to really think not just how tourism development can enhance and protect our environments and our economy, but also, importantly, that social aspect, that the communities, the residents that live in the areas in which tourism development is taking place. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Lovely to set the scene there. I'd like to invite Lesley now to share your response to our question. Is it possible to balance growth and sustainable tourism?
Okay. Thank you. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, great, okay. So thank you, Anna. I wanted to tell you just a little bit about Interface, if you don't already know. Interface brings together Scotland's business and academic communities to build environmental, economic and societal prosperity for Scotland, and we do that by matching businesses, third sector and public sector with academic expertise. We work with all sectors across all of Scotland, and we also support industry groups to tackle challenges. And that can be across food and drink, tourism, and we've helped many businesses develop sustainability practices and help them with transition to climate change and lots of different aspects. And we manage funding programmes to support that collaboration. So I'd be happy to talk to anyone if they're interested about that later. To address the question, is it possible to balance tourism growth with sustainable tourism? I don't have the answer to such a complex question, but I believe that a much more data-driven approach can help us gain the evidence that we need for strategic decision-making and for alternative business models, which I think it's clear that we probably need to look at this point in tourism's development. So technology and data, together with the right kind of leadership, inclusive collaboration, research-based innovation, can help address many of the serious challenges which we're experiencing at the moment, where the balance has clearly been lost between residents and visitors in so many communities, including on our own doorsteps, where the strain on local infrastructure that we're witnessing is having serious long-term consequences across housing, cost of living, transport, jobs. And I think that there is still often a disconnect between the people who market destinations and the people who have to manage destinations. There are lots of different approaches to the question that Anna has posed, but one which resonates with me is the Invisible Burden report, which was published in 2019 by Megan Epler-Wood and a team at Cornell University. And that report asserts, we need tourism which conserves the resources it depends on and sustains the well-being of local people for future benefit. So the report argues for a greater understanding of the costs that tourism has when it impacts on our infrastructure, on our local resources, on water, waste, energy, emissions, land and housing. And by understanding the cost per tourist compared to the cost per resident, it can help us with our financial planning, with tourism investment, budgeting, and perhaps new business models. So to connect the consumption of tourism resources to the management of tourism destinations requires a more data-driven approach and a shift in business models. So should we be costing the impact of visitors before we impose visitor levies? So what role can technology and data play to address some of the aspects of the question? Well, I can give you some examples of projects that I've been working with. So in the visitor management of our rural and coastal areas in Scotland, there are various working groups who meet regularly to exchange knowledge, to exchange information, agree on some agreed metrics, which some of that data is still collected manually, which goes back to government. And those groups include our national parks, councils, agencies, Visit Scotland, Forestry Land Scotland, and other groups. The digital working group, which I chair, is focused on sensor and IoT projects across many parts of Scotland. One of those projects is aggregating data and using AI, which has built algorithms to analyse that data so that it's predictive. So, for example, in Loch Lomond in the Trossachs National Park, in Perth and Kinross Council, rangers can see how busy locations are. They can look at the number of people, cars, motorhomes, tents. Rangers can plan follow-up visits the next day after campers have gone to make sure they've left the area the way it should have been left. They can quickly identify problem areas. They can predict how busy a site will be on a future date, and they can respond in a much more agile way to a rapid rise in visitor numbers. And I've got in my notes here, when the sun comes out. So, for example, that's when we would get a massive rise in visitors. On the visitor-facing side, the same data is being collected and relayed in an interactive web-based map. So visitors can check if car parks are busy, where to park a motorhome, EV charging, water top-ups, looking for wildlife. And the objective here is responsible trip planning. So a lot of the tools that are being developed using data are also being used to inform and educate visitors to behave more responsibly and try and make decisions before they arrive in the destination or while they're in the destination. And again, this group is also has been liaising with academics, which have helped them a lot with research, and startups. Tech startups are a big, important focus for us because very often they are developing solutions which can be really useful to this kind of challenge. So we regularly bring startups in when they have solutions that are of relevance. But some of the challenges here, there's a lot of costs in investing in this technology and maintaining how it's going to be financed. So that's one of the challenges. I think tech can also help us understand the views of residents. It can convene communities and citizens, and it can also help businesses understand their customers better, which can in turn help shape product development to respond to these issues. So we can build resident surveys, engagement platforms to seek views and determine visitor sentiment. We can also address visitor flows by implementing timed ticketing and booking systems, and learn more about the customer from the data that we get from these platforms. And that can also help staff allocation for businesses to be more efficient. And we need relevant and accurate data to inform regulation, to make business cases, and for policy making. We can use artificial intelligence to build more predictive models. We can access mobile phone and credit card data, but that's very expensive, and there are lots of challenges around data sharing, which I'm all too well aware of. So challenges, again, time, cost and skills. We need the right skills, particularly for more data-focused work. Tech can help us to build alternative business models to respond to tourism leakage, where profits from the big OTAs, online travel agents, for example, Booking.com, profits don't get reinvested in local communities. But even on a small scale, companies are working on that. So a company like Isle Holiday, which is based in Tiree, it promotes holiday rentals, but all the profits from the rentals are reinvested in working projects for islander communities. Airbnb, mainly based in Europe, again, a good example of guest profits going back into community projects. And again, understanding the customer and really working with customers and making an effort to engage with them can make a difference to product development. So the UK company Byway, which offers flight-free travel, tours by rail and ferry and bus, they are using AI and different forms of data to understand their customer behaviour. That's allowing them to plan different routes into communities which do need tourism growth and helping them look at alternative locations. So that can help with product development as well in terms of new business models. So some of the challenges here, how can we scale those solutions? Or can we influence the tech industry to do something a bit more community focused with the data that they have? And can we use data and tech to encourage more of this kind of activity? So what does the future look like? Well, who do we need to involve to effect change and to ensure that our tourism growth is sustainable and that we can balance the needs of residents and visitors? Research-based innovation, working with our academic colleagues, can help our tourism sector develop new skills, can help our tourism businesses become more socially or environmentally sustainable. Some examples from Interface. There's a Glenmore Hotel and Apartments in Inverness. They've been working with Glasgow Caledonian University to decarbonise their hotel's heating and water systems. They've also been working with Edinburgh College to adapt their recruitment policies to make them more inclusive and more sustainable in the longer term. We have the Scottish Cranach Centre in Perthshire, the visitor attraction. They have benefited from over 20 student-led projects, including stakeholder research, developing sustainable practices, and creating digital assets. And Destination Tweed and the Tweed Forum, we're currently in discussion with colleagues there to set up collaborative projects focused on the environment, but also to inform tourism visitors on the Tweed Trail and align with the South of Scotland Responsible Tourism Strategy. So how can we encourage more of this? So another way that I think is really important is sharing knowledge and best practice. Iceland is doing a lot of really good work on data to help visitors see where visitor sites are busy, when and where, and see that visually in order to plan booking their visits in advance. They're exchanging best practice with Visit Scotland, our national tourism agency, on what's worked in terms of visitor management solutions. Loch Lomond and Trossachs National Park has also been doing a lot of best practice exchange visits with Iceland. Innovation Norway and Destination Norway are also liaising with Visit Scotland. They're focusing on skills development for the sector, attracting shorter haul visitors who can stay longer, and balancing resident and visitor needs. Sweden in Business Stockholm has been involving school children in its placemaking, as they argue that they are the future residents, future workforce. So learning from others, how can we capture that momentum? How can we take even smaller steps to make changes? I think that's just a really important aspect as well. So to sum up, we need to address balancing growth with sustainable tourism, but we don't know what kind of growth, what's the definition of growth, what would that look like, who would it impact, who would it benefit? We need a collective effort, clearly, to act responsibly and collectively for the longer term. We need to balance ambition with responsibilities to our communities and our businesses. We need better data-driven strategies, or do we need new frameworks to tackle tourism's invisible burden, the cost on our infrastructure? Leadership and role models to effect change. Who needs to be in that room? Are all the voices in tourism development in our communities being heard? Residents are our greatest asset, so we should remember that. And research-based innovation. We need more academic industry collaboration to tackle challenges such as this evening. So I look forward to hearing your thoughts and ideas. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lesley. Fantastic insights there, and certainly quite a few things I'd love to pick up on a little bit later on.
I hope I didn't race through that.
I'd be delighted to welcome Sandro now to share his insights and his perspectives and response to our question as well.
Don't go away, Amy. Don't go away. I have a question for you.
Okay.
How many people fit in this room?
40?
40? Do you all agree? Well, it depends, right? If you're sitting or if they're standing. What about if they are lying on top of each other? If you can pile them up, right? But everyone lying, pile them up. Quite more than that.
Yeah.
Thank you, Amy.
Thank you.
I just wanted to start with that provocation because when you're talking about growth, we need to think about growth in a different, probably, perspective, right? So, apologies for my accent. I'm from Brazil. I've been here in Scotland for 13 years, but I haven't learned Scottish accent yet. I'm doing hard with my son, but getting there. And why is it important for me to say that I'm from Brazil? Growing up, we used to have holidays as well in Brazil, believe me or not. And my dad would take 4 weeks a year and would do one trip, the whole family, for 4 weeks somewhere in Brazil, or a couple of times overseas when we could afford. But it was a 4-week time, right? And I was quite surprised coming to UK. And obviously lived in New Zealand before, seeing that actually people don't take 4 weeks holiday anymore, right? People take a week, a weekend, 2 weeks, 3 weeks, if the company allows, right? So we see much shorter periods of time in terms of holiday. And I hope to get to the idea of why that change in tourist behavior is important for us when we're thinking about growth and sustainability. When they asked me to talk a little bit about growth, my first question is, growth of what? What we are talking about growth? Because the first thing that people think when you're talking about growth in tourism is about the number of tourists. But growth in tourism doesn't need necessarily to be the number of tourists. So the first thing for us to stop to think is about, when you're talking about growth in tourism, is growth of what? Because we can talk about growth of experience, growth of well-being, economic growth that not necessarily is the number of tourists, right? So are there alternatives for us to think growth? And even if we are thinking about economic growth, are there alternatives to think about economic growth that is not more tourists? Are there alternatives in terms of improving processes in the businesses or the destination? Reducing leakage that Lesley mentioned. Can we talk about economic growth, thinking about a diversification of the offers that we have? Can we think about growth, economic growth in tourism, if you change the profile of the tourist? And here, you may think about, oh yeah, if you get rich people, they will spend more money. It's not like that, believe me. Rich people don't always spend more money. There's actually a lot of work done in New Zealand, where I came from, about reducing the number of backpackers in order to have more cruise tourists, because the cruise tourists are rich and the backpackers are poor. And that would mean that they'll spend more money. That's not true, because we all know, and there's evidence, that people on cruise ships would spend less money in the town than actually the backpackers, who are not only spending money in the town, they're spending money in businesses that have less leakage, because they will spend the money in the local coffee shop instead of in the Starbucks, right? Other than that, there was a lot of research saying, okay, the backpackers will stay longer in New Zealand, and a lot of them would work in New Zealand if they have the visa condition, and that would also help in terms of the resources. So the problem of growth is when we are talking about the exponential consumption or growth in consumption of finite resources that we don't have forever. So if you go and ask a DMO about what's the capacity of your town, there's a high chance that the numbers they will tell you is the number of beds that are in hotels. So they'll say, well, the capacity of this town is 300 beds or 3,000 beds. But what about the capacity of the water supply? What about the capacity of electricity? What about of the capacity of the stressors on the local community, right? So we need to kind of rethink the way we discuss growth. And in order to do that, we need to understand the limits that are the built, the number of beds. We need to understand the limits of the natural capacity, and we need to think about the limits of the human resources as well. And all that we used to call carrying capacity, right? So the capacity that a place has to cope with that. And that led us as a concept that has been used and manipulated and shaped, that is the concept of sustainability. So how can you be sustainable if you're not talking about carrying capacity? And one of my criticism to tourism research is that a lot of them forgot to talk about carrying capacity. They talk about sustainability, but actually they forgot the basic term of carrying capacity. And if you go back to the idea of sustainability that I think Anna mentioned a little bit, and the original idea of stewardship and the concern for the future generations, will be the future generations be able to be in a place like that, a lot of them have been widely discussed in the previous 100 years. In the 1930s, for example, economists in USA were already discussing what was the optimal consumption level with the resources that were non-renewable. So how much we as humans can consume, and what is the optimal level with the consumption of non-renewable resources. So yes, there is then the Club of Rome and the Brundtland Report and a lot of these other reports that guide us in terms of understanding sustainability. And that came to the point where we discuss sustainability as the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the abilities of future generations to meet their own needs. And in that evolution of the term, we come to the business model of people, planet, and profit, right? And we think about people, planet, and profit as 33.3% of each. But we forget that the planet exists without the people and the profit. The profit is the only one who would not exist without the people and the planet. So the 33.3% cannot be linear discussion. People were here before, the planet was here before, and the thing that has been created was the profit. So we need to really be careful in understanding the relationship between these three concepts. And in that perspective, we go into the term of degrowth. And about, I think 2018, 2019, we wrote a paper about rethinking tourism and the concept of degrowth. And a lot of people come to me and say, how can I be a tourism professor, be anti-tourism? And I was like, well, it's not really like that. Read the paper, and then we can talk about. Because the concept of the growth of tourism is not that I want a decline of tourism. The concept of the growth of tourism is a rethinking process where we think tourism as a better thing than just an excessive consumption process. The concept of the growth, it is about living better with less. And that's very difficult in our current society, and I know that. The degrowth, I'm just watching the time here, sorry, yeah, I have 1 minute. So the concept of degrowth would give more focus and power to the local communities to decide where is the limit there. Because even in this room, when I ask the number of people that would fit in this room, there's a limit. And any space and environment, we have limits. And it is about the local community to make those decisions in terms of where is the limit of tourism and visitor in their economy, in their communities. And going from there, a colleague of mine, Freya Higgins de Bio, she talks about the relocalizing tourism, making tourism focus on the locals and empowering them to make those decisions. So the community should make the decision. It should have social contracts. The businesses, the local business should have social contracts. And the tourists should change from consumer to guests. And here's the point I want to make to you. Because if you have guests in your house, you may be the host that will tell them, please take your shoes off before you enter my house. You may be the guest, the host who say, yeah, just come on, whatever, paint the walls, let your kids destroy the room or whatever. You may be the host who will put, like we are in our house, we put all the mess in one room, lock that room, and make sure the visitor doesn't go to that room because that's where you put the mess, right? So you can think about the visitor in your house in the same way. Right? And there are destinations that have suffered with over-tourism, like Dubrovnik, and they've made a lot of changes they are trying to make a lot of changes to try to control that. And one of the ways to control the over-tourism in Dubrovnik is to better guide the tourists to where they want the tourists to go and how they want the tourists to spend their money. Yes, they have reduced dramatically the number of cruise ships and the amount of people that comes at the same time. But the other thing is, yeah, you are welcome to my house, but in my house, that's what you do first. You take off your shoes, and that's what you do second. You go to the living room, and you can use that toilet, but not that toilet. Right? So all these things are very important when we are relocalizing tourism and allowing the community to decide what are the spaces that they are welcome to share with you. And that's because the local community should be the guardians of the destination, which is one of the problems, for example, with Airbnbs or second homes, is that you lose that agency of community because you don't have neighbors anymore. You have lots of empty houses. So who is the community that is never there? The community doesn't care. They just have a house. And that's one of the problems of not having the agency of community in deciding what is going to happen in that place. So, over time, I'm sorry about that, Anna, but one of the things that I want to leave here is tourism in the future, the tourism now, because otherwise we'll be increasing our problems, should be a tourism that we should focus on the education of the visitor. And in that process of educating the visitor, we need to consider a new term that we've been using now, which is about carrying capacity, about how can we develop elements of care in those who are visiting my house? How the people visiting can care about my rivers, can care about my mountains, can care about my historical buildings. So developing that process of caring for the place where they are visiting is extremely important. Thank you. "13 minutes, sorry."
Thank you so much, Sandro. Thank you. I'm so looking forward to just getting straight into discussions. I have some questions for our panel here, and of course we'll open it up to our audience as well. To kick things off, I'd like to come to Lesley first of all, but panel, feel free to jump in as well.
Feel free to help.
For destinations still in the early stages of developing, so very much, economic growth is a priority, they're very early in the tourism sector, what strategies can they adopt to ensure that sustainability really is integrated from the outset?
Well, if they're starting from scratch, they've got a really good opportunity to try and avoid some of the mistakes that more mature destinations have made. And like I think we've all said, community consultation is paramount. You have to have the people who live there, your residents and your communities and your businesses, really fully engaged. And then I suppose you have to decide, what does growth look like? And what does that mean, and how is that going to help with employment, but also with skills? And sometimes, even though you want to develop a tourism economy, I think where I've seen a lot of things go wrong is that there's far too much reliance on the tourism economy. So you should be thinking about, if you're training people and helping them develop skills, what else can those skills be of value for? Yeah. And it could be much wider than tourism. So I think the community consultation and getting everybody involved at the very beginning, and they all have a say in what happens, and they decide what growth looks like, what does that mean for them?
Yeah, absolutely. Would you like to come in there?
Yeah, I think just following from that, I think I'm just becoming the chair of the new tourist leadership group in Renfrewshire. And one of the things that I think is important for us is to map the resources that we have. Mm-hmm. So one of the things is sometimes as local residents or people, we don't stop and think about, actually, what resources do we have? If you're doing a barbecue in your house and you only have 5 plates, but you have 35 people coming, it will be a bit odd, at least, right? So understanding the resources you have and understanding the carrying capacity is the first step. Then following from that, you need to think about, okay, what are the commercialization processes that you need to put in place for that? Because, maybe you don't need the plates. People can eat their barbecue using napkins, right? So you can think about, okay, how you commercialize with the resources that you have to maximize the benefit for the local community. Right? And that includes a couple of points. One is the protection of the environment and the resources, because if the visitor goes and destroys, that commercialization ends there. Anything that is destroyed, that's the commercialization done, right? You cannot commercialize after. The second thing is the personal development and training of your human resources. So the importance of training and developing your human resources. And the third one is bringing the community together in partnership and supporting each other. Because some people would be better to do the frontline service, other people will be better in implementing the technology, other people will be better to do the data analysis. So how you bring those people together. So just to not go too long, one of the things that we are doing in Renfrewshire now is they said, okay, we're going to do this tourism leadership group. And then they brought me a series of lists of tourism businesses, so hotels, camper van hires, things that were directly linked to the tourism. But then that's not all, because I need community groups as well. I need to know who are the influencers of the town. I need to know who are the good people who can communicate to the town. So I need more than just the people who are directly benefiting. and understanding that tourism is a process that is way more complex and impacts way more people than those that are directly working on it.
Can I just say one thing?
Of course.
I think I agree with Sandro. And also, how do you measure what your growth is? Because traditionally it's always been based on volume and value. It's always the number of visitors and the amount of money that they bring in. But those models don't really work anymore. So agreeing on how you're going to measure what that growth is or what the impact is in terms of your societal impacts as well.
Yeah. So that question of what does success look like?
Just to add to that, I mean, I agree with all of Sandro's and Lesley's points. I think that point about the community and who that actually is incredibly important, not just who the key influencers are, but every community is going to have a different demographic, and there's going to be those powerful voices who do engage with consultation, who do show up to these networks, these organisations time and time again. But those who are being most affected by changes in the community aren't really that represented. You know, thinking, you know, I live in the Borg Peninsula just outside of Kakubri. The voice of young people already isn't represented. It's already an older demographic there. So it takes a lot of effort to think about how you're going to engage with those people. They're not going to come to a meeting. They're not necessarily going to come to these sorts of events. So what are those engagement processes? How do you bring that voice in a way that reflects that community, that gives importance to that voice in the process? Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I'd like to pick up on something that we mentioned there. And Sandro, if it's okay, I'll come to you first. Just about that human resource and your kind of workforce development. What role does that play in ensuring both the growth and the kind of sustainability side of things for tourist destinations?
Yeah, and there is a lot of examples of that, a lot in rural communities where people want to develop a tourism product, but they just don't have the human resources in the region, right? And I was mentioning to you before that I've done some work with people from Lagan here, and their struggles in finding chefs and finding people to work in the kitchen and things like that is really evident. But it's more than that, because you want a tourism industry, if you want to call, or sector, that will not spend money in training and more training because they cannot retain people. So it's not only the recruitment of people, it's the retention of people. So we want the people who go and work in hospitality and tourism to feel that that's a career for them there, right? And that would also contribute to establishing a positive narrative, right? Which is the other thing that a lot of people don't talk about in terms of human resources is if we have people working in the tourism sector who truly believe on the visitor economy, who truly believe in the tourism product, the narrative around that sector is always positive. Now, if you have a workforce that doesn't believe on that, feel undervalued, undertrained, constantly moving on, what you have as a narrative is the industry, the sector is not good. And then actually you then have spent more money on training and more money on developing that positive narrative. And the final point is, if you don't need to spend a lot of money and time on training, recruiting, retraining, there's a high chance that your staff will have more time for them to think on an innovation, for them to think have time for creativity to develop new services, to develop new products, because you're saving that time and money of training, retraining, recruiting. So I think that's an important thing for us to think about. How do we value the sector and the workforce to a point where that narrative is positive?
Yeah, absolutely. Anna?
Yeah, I mean, just to add to Sandro's point, I think a huge part of this is also public investment. If the Scottish Government is going to be investing in tourism as a key economic driver in the economy, it also has to be thinking of investing in its workforce, of course, but in that new generation coming through and ensuring that they have that knowledge around sustainability that they can embed into the workforce. But what we're actually seeing is the opposite of that, with the pullback of the upskilling fund, with closures of many tourism programs, undergraduate, particularly across the UK and across Europe actually at the moment. We will find that those skills aren't going to be in the workforce over the next few years. So that that support has to be there if it is the key driver of the economy that the Scottish Government positions it as. Yeah.
And I think the upskilling, you're spot on, because the upskilling fund that has been pulled from the Scottish Government, it will be such a major impact, actually, because there is a lot of continuous professional development courses that universities used to offer that were free because of the funding. A lot of people coming from alternative sectors to events, tourism, hospitality, because of those courses and feeling that they had the first step into it. And now that is not there. And then you're asking a huge amount of investment for a sector that has been struggling to pay enough.
And I think then it has to come through the informal networks. Like there are, to put a more positive spin on it, there are really valuable networks that do talk about these things that don't cost anything to be a part of. For example, the EU has Next Tour, which is a network of sustainable tourism destinations right across the EU where they share best practice, they come together, think about what works, what doesn't work, and understanding the geographical specificity of why things are working and sharing that. I think, these more informal free networks are going to become even more important.
Collaboration is essential,
Yeah.
right? Because if you collaborate, then there's a high chance that you're reducing costs and then open the opportunities for other types of investments and so on. So.
Yeah. Fantastic, thank you so much. I have a question, a slightly different perspective, I suppose, but what does it mean to be a responsible tourist? So how can destinations kind of engage tourists in a way that aligns with sustainability goals while they're still getting that, enhanced experience where they are? I'd like to go to Anna first, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I think that both Sandro and Lesley have touched on it, and even I think Sandro's point about how we travel in different cultures, and some cultures taking whole months off. I think that's really key. Like, it has to come from the employer's infrastructure of facilitating people to take certain types of holidays and travel in certain ways to then allow the traveller, the individual, to make certain more sustainably conscious decisions. For example, do I need to travel multiple times? Do I need to take an international trip? Well, maybe you could just take one trip and actually spend quite a long time in a destination and really get to know it, invest in local businesses, stay with local businesses, rather than perhaps visiting many places very quickly. I think we all play a role in thinking about how we actually engage with those places. Yeah.
And there are examples now of a lot of destinations who are encouraging a bit of slow tourism, but they are also promoting better engagement between the tourist and the community. Because that's one of the things is, and I've been thinking a lot about that. So I was mentioned that I had a holiday. Sometimes we also take holidays with my family, and we decided to be a little bit slow and take a week in each 3 cities that we visited. So we were 3 cities and we stayed a week in each of them, almost a week in each of them, and finding what are the places where the community meets the visitor. And these are maybe the coffee shops. We went to a library in Gothenburg, that was in Malmö, that was absolutely amazing, because you can see that is a library prepared for that encounter between the visitor and it is a tourist attraction, let's say, but it's also welcoming for them too. So what are the places where we know the visitor can have a conversation with the guest? And why is that important? Because it's just by understanding the host perspective of life that we can empathize, is that the word? With the problems, the issues, how our behavior is impacting their lives or not, right? If you go to Venice, which is a place that everyone knows about the issues of over-tourism and overcrowded, how difficult must be for the tourists to understand what is the life of someone who lives in Venice, in terms of their daily lives, the cost of living, the traffic, the stress, the psychological issues, and so on, if they don't talk to the person. Because it's very easy for you on holiday feel that that's my holiday. I worked very hard and I have the privilege of, and I'm paying for. So one of the issues for me when you're talking about that is trying to educate and try to understand ownership. Who owns the place I'm visiting? It's not my place. I need to be grateful for being there, right? And understanding the rights. What are the rights of the locals in saying, actually, I don't want you here, right? I don't need you to come here. Or this place is actually not for you, right? And I think a lot of towns and cities are now saying, this is not for you. You're not actually welcome in this part of the country or in this part of the city or so on. So that process of education is very important. And I do think that this process of, it's funny because we teach a lot of things to kids. And I always ask me, why have you never taught the kids how to be better tourists? If they will probably, a lot of, in developed countries, a lot of them will be tourists at some point. At what point in their education process we talk about behavior as a visitor?
I think education and information is really crucial, and really trying to inform visitors about those things, about what's important in destinations and what needs to be protected, and trying to do that as far in advance as possible. And storytelling, like narrative has a big role to play. But some of the challenges about that are that the visitor management group have encountered is trying to reach visitors, like even if it's through social media channels or websites. You can have so much information available on websites and social media channels, but it's trying to reach visitors to inform them. So, for example, people that use motorhomes will very often use different forums and things like that, and they'll tell each other where they can park, where they shouldn't park, and so, or people that are like camping or illegal camping, for example. It's quite hard to you can put a lot of messages out on a lot of channels, but you don't always succeed in reaching people to get those messages across.
It's very interesting. There's, again, there's a lot of good practice around the world, and it's very difficult because sometimes what works in one culture doesn't work in another. What works in one regulation or regulatory framework maybe not works in another one. It's very interesting what's happening in Copenhagen just now, with the tourists being encouraged to leave the place better. Right, so it's like going and doing, picking up litter, or helping to clean the canals or whatever, and it seems to be working quite well, but it's still a fraction of the people, right? A lot of them is still mass tourism, mass consumption, and things like that. So I can see positive, and I can see that we are moving towards some good practice in terms of being better tourists. But I think without a more slow tourism, without, and I see students and they have 6, 7, 8 holidays a year. I was like, how? Why don't you, and it just feels that we still need to talk more about it at a very young age up to.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. I have one final question for you, but I really would like to open up to our audience and ask for questions in the room. If anyone would like to ask a question of our panel. We have one there. Yes, thank you. Got a microphone for you.
Yeah, okay. I'm going to ask the question now because I have to go after. Sorry. So thank you so much for putting up this panel, because it's been really good to see colleagues. And so last week I was at a tourism conference, and with scholars who've been working in sustainable tourism for 35 years. And the discussion was literally on abandoning the concept of sustainability as a whole, because basically it's a chimera. It's not working. And the reasons for that were primarily because the tourism system was grounded on the ideas of neoliberalism. So you're taking airlines, you're taking EasyJet, Ryanair. And to counter those waves of people and our students traveling 7 times a year, grounded on that model, is literally impossible. So the discussion was literally on limiting the impacts rather than trying to rethink the concept of sustainability in tourism. It doesn't mean we can't rethink it, but so I just wanted to have your views on literally keep using that idea and that paradox of sustainable tourism within tourism academia, but also in practice.
Drop the mic and then leave, right? That's right?
I think in my own work, I see it in two ways. I think you have the realities, that sustainability is the discourse, that's what we're working with, sure, Visit Scotland's moving towards responsible tourism, but it is similar, it's building on the same concepts. That's the reality, that's the pragmatics of what we're working with, and I think there's importance to continue that conversation and thinking about what can be done in that context while also having these broader conversations around degrowth at the very same time that we actually do need to completely rethink the model because it's just not working. I think personally the two can go parallel together and need to go parallel because otherwise what do you actually do? You're not going to have a revolution tomorrow. You have to keep building towards a lower, less intensive form of tourism because of the impacts that it's having. That's my personal perspective.
It's difficult.
The academics can say whatever they want. We can say whatever we want. To change that discourse from business, from policymakers, is a very different story. Actually, we've been talking about ditching the term sustainability. It's not something new. We've been talking about ditching the term sustainability for the last 10, 15 years at least, right? So, and we haven't not even got closer, right? Now, I fully agree. The term is very problematic, as I mentioned. It's very complex. It's being corrupted in many ways. I also prefer more responsibility instead of sustainability. Now, one thing is very difficult to change that discourse at action level, right? The way to start for me, so okay, how do we start to change that? Because maybe it's something that we need, is you need to choose. I think there is a stronger link between academic research and data, going back to data, and policy making. So I think the way to, if you want to change the narrative on the ground level, you need to change the data at the discourse on policy level first for me. The academics, that's where they will be able to influence probably more. And then that would cascade down to operational levels of businesses. But the term is problematic. And I think there is an assumption of academics, and I'm an academic, that businesses don't see it as a problematic, and that's not true. A lot of businesses see already the term sustainability as problematic, and they saw it a problematic before us, right? So we need to be careful with academic arrogance of that term doesn't work anymore, let's use this one, because that just doesn't help anyone, right? I think we can talk about the issues of the term, but what we need to talk is about the consequences of tourism.
Thank you very much. We have a question here. Thank you.
It's a sort of part B. Is this on? Yeah. It's part B, really, to follow up that question. I want to pick up on that term you've just used, academic arrogance. Linked to that, I wondered what the panel's views were on a perception which I think can come across that the different offerings and nuance, this kind of pivoting away from whatever traditional tourism looked like to these new offerings, that it's elitist and a bit of a middle class luxury offering, and how do we popularise that in the broad sense of the term, that it's something that everybody, regardless of budget, class, socioeconomic background, can feel is meaningful to them, and it's not an academic concept or a middle class worthy thing to do.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, that's a huge challenge. I think that's a massive issue, and there's in tourism, we talk about the democratization of travel that happened through the growth of travel. In a lot of ways, it's a positive argument, really, that more people can travel, more people can engage with other countries, but how we actually entice or open up those conversations so these alternative ways of travelling are actually open to everyone. I don't have an answer for that one. I think that's a real challenge that we have, and you can get stuck in these elitist arguments, and I think that's the limits of exactly what I tried to articulate in my own 10 minutes around the limits of sustainable tourism, because it is just a niche model at the moment for a very small number of people. It's not the way people travel. Yeah.
I don't know what the answer is either, but I would really like to see more younger people and more diverse audiences being involved in conversations about what tourism means to them and to a local community, and what that looks like, and what kind of products are being developed. Hearing more diverse voices and more younger people as role models and having their point of view across, because I'm sure that would probably give different perspectives from what we have in current leadership groups. That's, I think, important.
I think we've created far too many terms, far too many ideas, and it's not bad, right? It helps us to keep thinking, it helps us reflecting and things like that. But what is important is how we talk to policymakers, businesses, and students, right? When I go to my students, say, and I have a very, bad class, when I make them all feel guilty for traveling, usually their answer is, Sandro, that's great. You make me feel very guilty for my holidays in Spain. But is it actually my fault? Is climate change? Is that actually my 3 flights to Tenerife or to Ibiza? Is that me? Is that me who's doing that? And that's, I think, the point of that discussion is, well, actually, the students have a point, because sometimes it's very easy for us to point the finger, but actually, what about the issues of private jets, the growth in private jets? So we're talking about carbon emissions, right? And we're talking about the growth. One of the biggest problems is private jets, right? Or we're talking about the concept of the growth. Say, okay, you want to reduce the number of tourists, but if you reduce the offer and the demand, then is that going to increase the price? And then who can afford? It's only the rich people. Then you go back to the problems of So what is the solution there? And I think having that debate is an important point, because as Guilherme said, tourism is a neoliberal product of consumption, more consumption, and more consumption, right? So what about if we stop thinking, or not stop thinking, but start to think about tourism as a guest and host relationship of visiting and experience that we have? Can we then reduce a little bit of that process of consumption, right? But that level of debate, we need to get out of those paywalls of academic publishing and bring it to policymakers, bring it to businesses, bring it to councils, bring it to, and that's why a lot of our work is like my role for free extra work of leading a tourism leadership group is because I'm passionate about the potential that tourism can cause in people in terms of learning, developing, and so on, and how can I make it a bit better. And yeah, it is about taking that step and engaging with the people.
Thank you so much.
I'm not sure if we answered, but yeah, or we mumbled around.
I'm conscious of our time. Do we have any more questions? Yep, on there.
Thank you. This is more sort of targeting just one specific thing you mentioned about motorhomes. Just sort of through travel, I see more and more appearing. And how much do they actually give to the local community?
They give a lot of rubbish.
They're self-sufficient to a certain extent, so I apologise if anyone here has one.
No, it's a massive issue, and it's a growing issue. And there was research published recently by Visit Scotland. There was a report done. And I know it's an issue for lots of communities across Scotland, and we're still looking at ways to tackle it, essentially.
I think it's an organisation or a company there, is it CAP? No, what's it called now? But they're trying to get sort of local communities to, or local councils, you should say, to set aside specific places.
Yeah.
But then they would then get money back in from that rather than just free parking and lay-bys and, as you said, sometimes illegal places. But
yeah, I mean, like we were talking about that, yeah, which I think, could be a potential solution.
Definitely, the service centres, and it goes back to this point about people being guests in our place and how we want them to behave, how we want them to move around. If we say, this is where, if you created a service centre and said, this is where the motorhomes have to park overnight, there's facilities for waste management, there's laundry, there's toilets here, everything you need is here, there's shuttle buses to some of the key local attractions. I think this is what they're talking about in the Highland Council, and I think that it could be...
I think there's more of those community-owned caravan parks and things like that, but, and again, is the caravan is a problem in multiple ways. One is traffic, that like if you go to New Zealand, and I lived in New Zealand, it's like, honestly, people absolutely hate them because they are everywhere. People don't know how to drive on that side of the road because, it's just, it's stressful for the local community, right? They park where they shouldn't park, they throw the rubbish where they shouldn't throw the rubbish, and things like that. But it's about the behavior, right? It is the behavior. It's about them knowing that if before they go to Sky, they stop at the Asda, buy all the food there and don't spend any money in the local community, they're just using the local community. So they need to think about that before, right? And then how you make them thinking about that before is a lot of work probably with who's hiring them. Who's hiring the camper vans, maybe if you're thinking about that. And how the people hiring the camper van maybe start to shape that behavior of the people. Because, yes, you can go into the regulations and ban and this and that. You could go on that as well. But there are also other ways you can think about. Cruise ships is the same. Actually, for me, cruise ships is even worse. Because cruise ships, you're talking about mass. And the volume of money they spent in the town is proven that it's minimal compared to how much they spend inside the boat, and the money from that boat to go to Cayman Islands where they're not taxed. So no one, there's a lot of other issues with the cruise ships that people don't know how to tackle. Now, one of the things that they want to do in Renfrewshire is, okay, how are we going to work with the cruise terminal in terms of shaping that tourism in order to try to maximize whatever we can maximize from that tourism experience. But it's difficult. It is very difficult.
Sorry. I think with the motorhome issue, I think that, again, the costs of managing waste and the impact that they're having on local communities has to be quantified and made available. So it should be, motorhome users should be told what the impact that they have on local communities and the costs involved. Because I saw an article at the weekend saying that Sky wanted to use automatic number plate recognition, which is a kind of technology, and it would impose the equivalent of a kind of visitor tax on motorhomes. But who's going to do that? That involves a whole lot more work and engagement between councils and how would that be collected? Where would the point of entry be, or photography, and would that would that work? I don't know, but there have to be working and more workable solutions for them. But I think if people understand the costs and the impact that they're actually having on the community, which they probably don't have enough of, I think that could be more powerful as well.
Thank you very much. Thank you. I believe that's all we have time for this evening. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, for joining us this evening. Thank you to our wonderful panel for your insightful presentations and your responses to some really excellent questions. If I could ask one thing of our audience this evening, it would be, let's not stop the conversation here. Let's use our networks, our new firm connections, and continue these discussions. The School of Social and Environmental Sustainability at the University of Glasgow is here, and we are ready to carry on the conversation, and we hope that you will join us in working together to address the complex issue of balancing growth with sustainable tourism. Thank you very much.